little bit. There wasn't as many of us here, but last week we deviated away from following the 1, 2, 3. We skipped ahead to Thou shalt not kill because it was Sanctity of Human Life Sunday, and we wanted to recognize that, and we saw the importance of life and why life is important, why each individual life is important to God. But today, as we continue on, we're going to go ahead and get to the second commandment. Now, I wanted to point out that we covered when we talked about why we have the law. We went to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and we saw in verse 5, it says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of your strength." Now, in that one commandment, that was not part of the 10 commandments, but in that one statement, we see the basis of the first 4 commandments very clearly. And, of course, when we see it later on, we saw in Leviticus that the rest of that was given, that Jesus told us. But when Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment, he said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And when he said that, what he was basically saying, and he went on to say, upon these are the rest of the commandments. All of the commandments that we have, it's not about this set of rules, and we've talked about this over and over. It's not about just this set of rules, but it's about the relationship. It's about the love for God. It's about the love for your neighbor. And if we really have our love for God and love for the neighbor the way that we're supposed to, then the rest of the laws should be easy to follow. But it's about establishing that relationship. But today we're going to talk about having no idols. No idols in our life. And I'm going to surprise some of you with some of the things that some of you may be doing. I may step on a few toes today. I may make some people mad today. If I do, I do. I'm sorry. But that's the way it is. But in Exodus chapter 20, we see the 10 commandments, but today we'll start in verse 4. And it says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to them who love me and keep my commandments." Now, God gave them this set of rules. And this first one says, "You shall not make any carved images." Now, you know how long it took. This was the first commandment that they broke. This is the first commandment that they broke after they made the covenant. Now, we see that Moses continued, after God gave him these in chapter 20, he continued on for a little while up there, and God continued to pour into him, and about 6 more chapters of the rest of the law, how you deal with this, how you deal with that. And then Moses brings down this law to the children, and he says, "This is the law. This is the law that God has given. This is what he has put forth. This is his covenant with you. Will you accept it?" And they say, "Yes. Yes, we will do everything that this law says. We will commit to this law." And Moses said, "All right, you have joined in this covenant with God." And he goes back up on the mountain, and he presents to God and says, "The children of Israel have said they will follow the covenant." And God says, "Then I'm going to write it in stone." And while he was up there, while God was writing this in stone, while he is giving this to Moses, and while Moses is there, not only does he give him the tablets, he also shows him, "This is how I want my tabernacle built. This is how I want it decorated. This is how you are to build the ark. This is how you're to build this. This is how you're to do all this." He gives him all this, and by chapter 32, we see, I put 34 on there, but in 32 it says, And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. Then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." Now remember when we talked about the first commandment, God made it clear. He said, before he said, "You shall have no other gods before me," he made it clear because he said, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt." Now they're sitting here before this molded calf and said, "O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." So when Aaron saw it and built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." Then they rose early on the next day, offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So the very first thing we see is they make this idol. They make a graven image. Now, we've always imagined this is a god. They're worshiping this as their god. But Aaron here is, as we see, he's stating that this is the God that brought him out of Egypt. Here is a thing that we have happen from time to time. This is what really messes us up. We feel like we need something to visualize. We feel like we have to have a visual thing to worship. The children of Israel, some think that they were making this God that they had in Egypt, but some think that they were just they just needed something to visualize, and this was their representation of God. Because he stated, "This is the God that brought you out of Egypt." So therefore, some believe that this was just their visualization of God. Now, I have y'all have heard the old joke. There's only 2 rules you need to follow. Number 1 is I'm right. Number 2, if I'm ever wrong, refer back to rule number 1. Well, that's kind of the way God is here. You know, the second commandment. If you have a problem with the second commandment, go back to rule number 1. Go back to commandment number 1. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. Now that first commandment had to deal with who they were to worship. But this second commandment, it goes a little deeper. Because it starts to talk about how we are to worship. I remember growing up. In our church, there was a picture set right at the back of the choir loft. And many of you probably have that same picture in your house. My grandmother had one that my uncle painted for her. That was it was a velvet painting. You got to remember this was done back in the 60s by my uncle. The velvet paintings. If you have a depiction of Jesus in your house, that is a graven image. That is a graven image because there is nothing. There is no artist. There is nothing on this earth that we can even imagine that can represent God. Now, I will tell you something. If you have that picture of Jesus, that is Leonardo da Vinci's interpretation of what he thinks Jesus would look like. It has been told that he used a homosexual model to paint that by. But I can tell you first off that, number 1, it does not look like Jesus at all. If you study the Scripture, Jesus did not even have long hair. But that picture does, and that is what... But here's the danger of this graven image. This is the danger that this is why God said not to make any graven images. When we look at that picture, now we are visualizing our God to look like that. We are visualizing. We think we've got to have something to visualize. We've got to have something to hold up. This is what happened to the children of Israel. This is why they kept turning back, and that's why they kept raising up Asherah poles. That's why they kept putting up temples to Baal. That's why they started worshiping the Philistines' god of Dagon. They started worshiping these things because they had to have something visual to worship. That's part of why God gave them the ark. But let me tell you something. Had they worshiped the ark, they would have been just as much in trouble as if they worshiped the golden calf. We don't need to represent God. God represents Himself. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 18 says, "To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare to Him? The workman molds an image. The goldsmith overspreads it with gold, and the silversmith casts silver shades. Whoever is too impoverished for such a contribution, choose a tree that will not rot. He seeks for himself a skillful workman to prepare a carved image that will not totter." Then in verse 25 it skips down and says, "To whom then will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal? Says the Holy One." Do you think there is an artist on this earth that can make a worthy image to compare to God? Can even the finest gold be formed into anything that is worthy of God? Is there any tree, any wood, any metal that will outlast God? The thing is we have nothing to make. Now, here's the thing. These pictures of Jesus, the cross. How many times, I don't know how many times in movies that you see people wearing a cross around their neck, and they'll take that cross and they'll kiss that cross. Are they using that cross as a form of worship? How about the cross? Is that not a graven image that the Catholics use? The statues of Mary that they bow down to pray to? You see, we have so many things, even religious symbols that are supposed to point to God are graven images that are a danger to us. They are a danger to us because we start to worship the wrong thing. Let me tell you something. The people in Brazil that worship the Christ Redeemer statue, God does not need a graven image. God does not need something for us to bow down to. Matter of fact, we're told here that he tells us not to make a graven image or a molded image of anything on the earth or anything that is in heaven above. Listen, even if you try to make a throne, even if you try to take the description of an angel. Now, right after he said this, he gave Moses this vision. And he says, I want you to go down from this mountain, and I want you to find this craftsman, use this specific craftsman, and I want you to build this ark, and I want you to overlay it with gold, and I want you to make this lampstand and make it look like almond blossoms. I want you to put pomegranates on all this stuff, and I want you to make these two cherubs that their wings touch, and they all. These are things of the earth and things that are in heaven, right? But God said to make them. Right after he said not to make any graven images. So I want you to understand something. I want you to recognize something here. This ark that God stood before them, it was God's seat. It was the representation of God, and it was not to be worshipped. The cherubs that were put in the Holy of Holies, they were put there. They were never seen by the masses. They were put in the Holy of Holies where only the high priest could go. They were not for the children of Israel to worship. They were to make a representation of God's throne room in heaven. The children of Israel, the only time they saw the Ark of the Covenant was when it was being moved. The only time they saw these angels was when the tent was torn down and they were wrapped up and moved. The only time they saw the mercy seat was when it was all ready to move. This was not a part of their worship. It was only a place that was a representation of God's presence. They were not items for the people to worship. When we make these graven images, and many times in life we make these things innocently. We don't think a thing about the cross or the pictures or things like that. But let me tell you, God gave us this warning because when we assign a vision of what we think God would be, we start to worship that thing. We start to, that's what we start to picture when we worship. Many people have seen that picture of Jesus, so therefore when they pray, that's what's in their mind. That's not what Jesus looked like. That's not a representation of Jesus. You see, Jesus told the woman, though, at the well, though, God is a spirit. He is to be worshiped in spirit and in truth. In other words, He doesn't need the cross for you to worship. He doesn't need a golden calf. He doesn't need an Asherah pole. He doesn't need a statue. He doesn't need all of these things because we are to worship Him in spirit. And therefore, when we do that, we don't need to assign a vision to God, because nothing of this earth, nothing that can be placed on this earth, nothing that can be drawn or pictured or anything of that nature can even come close to representing God. So if we can't represent Him, why should we make something to represent Him? Nothing even holds water around Him. Psalms chapter 50 and verse 9, it says, I will not take a bull from your house, nor goat from your fold, for every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. And I know all the birds of the mountains and the wild beasts of the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all of its fullness. And we see this, and we see that God says, in other words, I don't need your stuff. I don't need you. Many of the gods of that day, people would bring food to them. And He says, I don't need your food. If I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I can do all this for myself. So therefore, in the same way that He says, I don't need your food, I don't need your house, I don't need anything that you can provide me. All He wants is our submission. He don't need us to represent Him. He don't need us to build Him a house. He told David that when David offered to build the temple. He said, I don't need you to build me a temple. I want you to worship me for me. And that became a downfall. Listen, the temple, even though God allowed Solomon to build the temple for him as his dwelling place, as a permanent place for his ark to reside, you know what that became for the children of Israel later? It became a stumbling block. It became a place that they misrepresented God. It became a place where Jesus went in and threw people out of, because they started to take the thing that was supposed to represent God and used it for the wrong purpose. Listen, things can have a good purpose, but if we use them wrong, they can be our downfall. As a matter of fact, we talked a couple weeks ago about the bronze serpent. This bronze serpent. Of course, you know the story that the snake started biting the children of Israel out in the woods because of their unbelief, because of their failures. And God said, okay, Moses, make for them this bronze serpent and hold it up on a pole. And when they get bit by one of them snakes, if they'll look to that serpent, then they won't die. And you know what happened? They started relying upon that serpent, and many years later in the book of Kings we see that they started worshiping that bronze serpent. It was a thing that God established. It was a thing that God gave to them for a purpose, but yet it became their downfall because they started to forget God, and they started to take that representation and they started to assign it a purpose. Let me tell you something. When we start to assign things of God and start to worship them instead of God, then we have become a downfall. We're in a world right now where we're in a society where people think that we are to worship Mother Earth. There are so many people out there right now that they'll state they don't believe in God, but they think we're supposed to worship the earth. I love our earth. I'll just tell you, I do. We couldn't live without it. It provides us everything we need. The earth includes the sky around it and the atmosphere and all the things and the water. And listen, we got to have it. And I think that over the years, and especially through the growing years of our country and the growing years of many of the countries, the industrialization time, it was greatly misused and greatly abused. And I think we do need to take a little better care of it. But let me tell you something. It is part of the creation of God. And when we worship the creation, you hear about tree huggers. When they put the tree ahead of the man who created the tree, or the God who created the tree, then they're the downfall. When we worship the earth, or put the earth ahead of the God who made the earth, anything can be our graven image. Anything that we put forth ahead of God. For some pastors I know, this pulpit has become their graven image. I know many pastors that have assigned this the name of this is the holy desk. There's absolutely nothing holy about this. I can teach just as good preach just as good off that table right there. There's nothing holy about it. And when we start to assign things holiness, then we have made them graven images. Leviticus chapter 26 says, in verse 1 says, "You shall not make idols for yourself, neither a carved image nor a sacred pillar shall you rear up for yourself, nor shall you set up an engraved stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God." He didn't say don't set them up to another god. He didn't say don't set up a graven image to Baal. He didn't say don't set up a graven image to Asherah, even though that was part of it. And that was part of the problem, was the children of Israel were worshiping Baal and Asherah and Dagon and all these other things. He covered that in Commandment 1. But Commandment 2, he says, don't even set up things that are supposed to represent me. Don't get used to these graven images. Do you know in Israel that the coins today, they still will not put a picture of a man on it? But guess what? Their money, their paper money, has Ben Gurion on it. You know what their money has on it today? A palm tree. Guess what? That's still a graven image. It's still a graven image. He said not. He didn't say just not of any person. He said not of anything in heaven or in anything on the earth or anything under the earth. A palm tree classifies in that, right? We don't need any graven images. God doesn't need anything to represent Him. Now, the children of Israel and the Jews in Jesus' day, this was one of the things that brought destruction upon when Jesus came into the temple, started throwing people out of the temple. It was because of the money changers. The Roman money at that time had Caesar's picture on it. We know that because When they came to Jesus and said, is it legal for us to pay our taxes? Jesus said, whose picture's on it? He said, Caesar. And he said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. So we know that the picture had... Now, here's what they did. They set aside the tradition, said you can't use money that's got a picture of Caesar on it to pay your tithe to the church or to buy your sacrifice with. So now you gotta come and you gotta change that money for this money, and then you can buy your sacrifice with this money. And it was a way of making money, and that's why Jesus threw out the money changers. When you read it, it's what he threw them out for. But they took this, and it's all right for us to put a graven image of a palm tree on this one, but you can't have a picture of Caesar and buy this with it. You see, they started to take it and to twist it. They twisted it to the point that was beneficial for them. We need to recognize that we don't need a building. We don't need a statue. We don't need a picture. We don't need an image in our mind to worship God. Because here's what happens when we try to imagine something. We fail. John, when he wrote the book of Revelation, when God gave him that revelation, when he gave him that prophecy, we see the New Jerusalem that comes down, and we see the description of it, and we see the gates made out of a single pearl, and we see the walls made of the 12 foundations of the wall. We see the streets of gold. We see all of these beautiful things, and we try to imagine it. And let me tell you, what you're imagining right now, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about these the foundations that are made of sardis and all these amethyst and all these different beautiful stones that are a rainbow color of the foundation. And the walls, 1,200 stadia. And we see this the crystal river, and we see it. And as you're imagining all that, it don't even come close. No matter what you're imagining, no matter what picture you've got in your mind right now, it don't come close to what heaven will really be like. You know why? Because John used earthly things to try to describe a heavenly place. And he did the best he could. I want you to think about something. Imagine, now y'all seen, how many of y'all saw Top Gun, the movie Top Gun? It came out in the 80s, you've seen it. The new one just came out, I think it's even better. Now the old one, they flew an F-14. And it's an amazing plane. I want you to think about trying to describe that F-14 to somebody that's never even seen a car. Now just try to imagine this. Try to explain this plane that can go almost twice the speed of sound, landing on a boat that's big enough for a plane to land on, to somebody that's never seen a gasoline engine. Now try to think of what it would have been like for John to describe a place that is made of things that our minds cannot imagine. Made of things that I believe there's things in heaven that we don't even have on this earth. I believe there are things that are more pure and more beautiful than gold that we don't even have on this earth. Imagine trying to describe that. So with knowing this, anything that we ascribe to God, to worship God by, will fail miserably. What happens though, Philippians 3:19 says, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their minds on earthly things. When we assign a calf, as the children of Israel did, as we assign a calf to God, then we end up like the Hindus and worshiping calves. You know, they worship their cattle more than they do their people. And that's the danger when we assign something of earth to God. Then we start to worship that thing. You see, now, when we talk about idolatry, we idolize a lot of things. I'll just tell you, I really hope, you know, there's danger of speaking about politics or sports from the pulpit. I know that, but I really, really hope that Kansas City does not get in the Super Bowl. And it's not because I don't like Kansas City, but I'm tired of everybody idolizing Taylor Swift at the Kansas City football games. We idolize performers. We idolize sports figures. We idolize. Oh, here's a big one that most people today. Our phones. We idolize things. But this is not just about idolizing our things, because that's putting them before God, and that covered the first one. But graven images, we let them in innocently. And like I said, many times it's a picture. It's a picture of, most of you women especially have had a picture sometime. Most of you guys wouldn't carry it, but most of y'all have had a mug or something that's had one of these little baby cherubs on them or something, or, you know, or we see these pictures of angels. And let me tell you something. Even the angels that came to the earth, when people bowed down, said, no, don't bow down to me. But that's the danger we get in. When we put pictures, statues, crosses even. There's no greater thing that we see. You know, like I said, the children of Israel did it with the serpent, the bronze serpent, but people today do it with the cross. The cross is not Jesus. The cross is God, and if we worship, if we talk about, and we've got one sitting over here, but if we bow down to that cross, and that is our graven image. I've been at youth conferences where we were encouraged to pray at the foot of the cross. We're assigning that cross to God when we do that. Nothing of this earth, nothing in our minds, no picture, nothing can represent God, and we have to remember that. God is a spirit, and we must worship Him in spirit and truth. When we worship, we need to recognize, first of all, that God created everything. This earth is His creation. We are His creation. Never worship a creation. Never assign God anything that is part of creation. And that's a danger when we put something in our mind that we worship. God is greater. He is the creator. He is not created. He's no creation. And therefore we must not bow down or worship to any creation. Worship Him in spirit and truth. Give Him your all. make Him just God of our heart. The Spirit who dwells within us. That's who we need to focus on. Because He is a Spirit. If you're here this morning and maybe you've got some picture of what you think God is. And I know a lot of people that I've tried to talk to about God in the past, and they'll say stuff like, "Well, I've got my own God. I've got my own thing I worship." Many Christians do that too. If you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus Christ as your Savior, and if the Spirit of God does not dwell within you, don't assign something to Him. Worship Him here. If you don't know Him today, come get to know Him. And I'll help you to understand who He really is. If you don't know Him today, then the invitation is to come and get to know Him. But beyond that, as we come, worship Him in spirit. Don't assign things to Him. Don't worship a picture that Grandma had. And like I said, don't even worship the cross. The cross was an instrument that was used. It was an instrument of death, by the way, used by the Romans. Worship Christ. Worship the Spirit. Worship God and Him alone. We don't need anything to recognize Him, because if we do, we'll fail miserably. And if you know Him truly and you know Him in your heart, then that's the only thing we need to worship Him. The children of Israel did that. They kept trying to assign things to Him, and they turned and ended up worshiping those things. Keep your worship pure and with God alone. As Matthew comes, let us stand this morning. Lord, I thank You this morning as we do come and we do worship You, and we want to recognize You, and we want to hold You up as holy, Lord. We recognize that nothing in this world is holy but You. Lord, help us to acknowledge that. Help us to always focus on You, and not any created thing, but on You alone. In Your name we pray.